This video reflection is inspired in large part by an interactive small group reading exercise Mary K. Greer led during the Masters of the Tarot conference at the Omega Institute a couple weeks ago. The question to ponder is divination always accurate? Is a divinatory reading always reliable and credible? If you're a tarot reader, are the cards always right? If I present the same question to, let's say, the I Ching Book of Changes 10 times, casting 10 different hexagram readings, and these readings seemingly contradict each other, which reading is the right one? Do I take an average, the median? Are any of these readings going to be credible? Is a divinatory reading always right? And what if I present the same question 10 times to 10 different diviners, be that 10 different I Ching practitioners or 10 different individual tarot readers, or cast 10 different horary charts to answer that same exact question? How do we reconcile all of these divination events to arrive at the right answer or any reliable answer for the question presented? I'll post a link to Mary's public Facebook post presenting one of the small group exercises that we had worked through, and I think it's a really great one for you to ponder for yourself. In Mary's exercise, really interesting questions with ethical implications were presented. Here's the key philosophical question. If your objective clinical reading of the tarot cards on the table indicate one answer, but based on the question and the querent's circumstances, all forms of red flags go up immediately for you, your gut, your independent intuition, your logic, your real world life experiences, all of it is pushing you to warn the querent to do the total opposite of what you would interpret clinically or objectively the tarot cards to be saying. What do you do? What do you say? Which harkens back to that fundamental philosophical question. Is a divinatory reading always right? Are the cards always reliable? How much of your own, let's call it what it is, bias, even if it's a positive bias based on your real world experiences, should be factored in to reading the cards or to any divinatory reading? And just to start things off, I don't think any of us should jump immediately to one decisive side or the other. I do think it helps to appreciate the complexity and the layers of this philosophical inquiry. So for instance, let's say your clinical interpretation of a divinatory reading indicates, yes, go for that romantic relationship. But the circumstances and context you get from that querent is that, I don't know, let's say the querent wants to cheat on their life partner and is asking about whether to cheat on that life partner. Generally speaking, with today's cultural sensibilities, you will get a lot of readers saying, hey, just read the signs and omens as objectively as you can. Be objective, don't be judgmental. Just answer the question without judgment or bias. Okay, so now let's say those circumstances and context implies a non-consensual scenario due to a severe power dynamic. You get my drift, right? Suddenly, a lot more readers, because of today's cultural sensibilities, are going to interject real-world experiences, a protective bias, and maybe this protective bias is positive and beneficial in this particular case. But they're going to interject real-world experiences and their personal biases to try to steer this querent away from doing the thing. So in a way, a lot of readers pick and choose, they cherry pick which taboos we can overlook and which taboos we are going to interject our biases into. And if we're going to do that, then I think we need to establish parameters and some set of standards or codes for determining when to read clinically without judgment or bias about taboo subjects and when to interject our own moral and ethical codes when reading about said taboo subject. Then there's the additional uncomfortable question of how differently different tarot readers will interpret the same spread of cards. So in Mary's hypothetical, the specific 3-card reading she presented was intentionally ambiguous in the sense that you could argue that it says yes, and you could make the credible case for arguing that the answer is no, and you can even make a credible case arguing that the answer is maybe, or wait and see, or need more info. And in our small group exercise, all of those answers came up from pro tarot readers. Seasoned expert pro tarot readers all came up with different answers in their objective clinical interpretation of the same exact 3-card spread for the same exact question. I think the default defense we diviners often make is, yes, divinatory readings are always right, but the human interpreter could have misinterpreted, so the reader might be wrong. We're trying to shift the blame or fault onto the human and then leave the divinatory tool faultless in pristine, perfected condition. So the divinatory tool remains divine. But can you actually separate the divinatory reading from the reading perspective of the reader? Can you separate the two? So like I pull 3 cards. Hold on. So I pull 3 cards to answer your question. And let's say your question is word for word with no further context. Tell me yes or no, and anything else you're able to reveal at this time. So I'm just going to pull 3 cards. Knight of Pentacles, King of Cups, Key 6, the Lovers. When I was playing around with this thought exercise with my tarot colleague friends, I mean, the first question that comes up is, well, what are the spread position meanings, right? So then now you immediately start having these really, divisive debates-ish about, well, okay, is this a 3-card spread? Are you doing past, present, future? What is this? Mind, body, spirit? No spread, a string of cards? What's happening here? And if you don't have more information, supplemental insight as the tarot reader doing a clinical second opinion reading of these 3 cards, does that stop you? Like, are you just going to stop there and say, I can't interpret because I don't know if it's a spread or if it's not a spread? I don't know what's happening. So my reading of the cards, okay, it looks like there's a disconnect between what your heart wants, where your emotions are pulling you toward, and then finite resources, whether or not you can bankroll this decision, whether it's a financially or materialistically resource-wise prudent decision. And even with that reading, I have to interrogate myself. How much of that is like a textbook or intuitive psychic reading of those 3 cards? And how much of that is just general common sense? Because if you've lived some years, you know that that is a repeated theme that people go through when they are faced with a decision. To the yes or no question, I would make the call, yes, go for it. But I would maybe just caution that after you say yes and decide yes, there may be a fall out of Eden to confront real world consequences. But ultimately, it's worth it. And in terms of supplemental insight that this querent would want, I mean, seeing the Knight of Pentacles, the slower of the 4 knights, I would say, take it slow, okay? Just take it one step at a time. Don't rush things. How would you clinically interpret those 3 cards? And other really interesting questions come up as well. So for example, the specific deck that I'm using, the King of Cups, looks like this. Classically, one of the interpretations, if you're thinking about court cards as personalities and figures in our lives, there's a father figure aspect to the King of Cups. There's a King Charlemagne aspect to the King of Cups. But are those the conclusions you would arrive at if you visually see this depiction? Good question, right? So then what do? Do you read the cards within the 4 corners of the card itself? Or do you pull in classical card meanings memorized or from your portfolio of card meanings that you've tucked away in the back of your head, irrespective of what you see within the 4 corners of the card? I don't know. I don't think there's a right or wrong answer here. The Lover's card. Some modern readers might go in the direction of interpreting this reading as revealing of a love and romance question. Other readers are not going to take that approach with the Lover's card in the tarot. They're going to see it as choice, twin paths, parallel paths. You know what? I have an I Ching book to promote, so let's do I Ching as well. We're going to do coin toss because a girl doesn't have all day to sit here counting yarrow stalks or rice grains.
Yikes. I had no idea you could see my pajama pants from this angle, and not just the nice shirt I put on. Well, too late to re-record this now.
Now, even with I Ching divination, if you are reading in English and beholden to the English translation that you have, and you aren't reading the original Zoe in classical Chinese, does it matter which translation you use? Most I Ching practitioners who are beholden to the English translation would say yes, absolutely. Even those who can read Chinese, especially those who only read modern Chinese and are not as familiar with classical Chinese, it's going to be really tough to read the classical Chinese without somebody annotating and interpreting the classical Chinese for you into modern Chinese. So funny enough, and because this is not pre-planned or pre-scripted in any way, I mean, they kind of echo and align. So, but they don't always, right? So that's the thing. Like they could have contradicted each other. It just, is it coincidence or is it not coincidence? I don't know. But, so coincidentally enough, they kind of, what I just pulled in terms of a 3-card reading and the I Ching divination, they do align in this particular incident. Now is the time to advance. May the pawn become the queen, which is kind of interesting because you had those court card references in the tarot, and now you have kind of a similar royal court reference in this as well. Even my 2 changing lines, line 5 and line 6, basically is giving a green light, auspicious to move forward. So yes, the answer is yes. There is progress in the advancement when the horns are lowered. If you recall the 3-card reading, the Knight of Pentacles, horns, Taurus, proceed with conquest of the city. It is a perilous undertaking, and yet the prospects are good. Like it really echoes what I just said half a minute ago when it came to the 3-card tarot reading, right? The I Ching reading is saying, well, first it's saying that you've been hesitating for too long. It's time to stop the heavy foot and get going. Show your loyalty to somebody who hierarchically is above you and you will be rewarded. So that's kind of a bit of advice in terms of how to get what it is that you want, which is really interesting because that does align with that Archangel, well, in my deck, it's called the Archangel of Healing, the King of Cups card, right? The other bit of advice from the Book of Changes is advance like a mouse, but mount the throne like a lion. The changing lines, which is the heart of the answer to be provided to the querent, is to go forth and conquer the city, no matter how perilous the advancement, says the oracle. There's a warning that tears will be shed. There are consequences to this ambition of yours, but ultimately it's for the greater good. It will all pan out as it should. So that didn't work out because they were supposed to contradict each other. I kind of assumed and banked on the tarot reading and the I Ching reading contradicting each other, so then we can have this philosophical conversation about what happens when divinatory readings on the same question contradict. Actually, it does still work for the purposes of my philosophical inquiry because I know that there's going to be an I Ching practitioner who sees the result. Okay, let me go get the result. Well, take any I Ching translation or the original Zoe of your choice and interpret it. Clinically, you're going to get practitioners who disagree with how I just interpreted the result. So then what? What happens then? What happens when multiple valid practitioners interpret the same reading result very differently, especially if they interpret it differently in ways that contradict or conflict with each other? Same with the tarot reading. I'm sure there are going to be tarot readers who saw those 3 cards and actually answered in the negative and said, no, the answer is no, not yes. What do you do with that? Are we really going to say someone's right and someone's wrong? Oh, well, you wait till the thing happens, and when the thing happens, then you know for sure and can validate who was right and who was wrong? To me, the greater theoretical question is, can you separate that 3-card reading or this moment of an I Ching casting? Can you separate it from me? Can the divinatory reading result be separated and in an isolated way interpreted apart from the diviner? The diviner whose hand cast the reading and who is now interpreting the reading that their hand cast. Can someone like you, who is not me, who is not part of this divinatory ritual moment, or are you part of this divinatory ritual moment just by virtue of watching this video? I don't know. Could somebody else, a third party, come in later, look clinically at the reading result and interpret it objectively to get to a right answer? Because maybe you can make the case that, well, there is a certain established, collectively assigned meaning to certain pressure points represented by the divinatory tool, a certain card in the tarot deck, a certain line in the I Ching hexagram. Therefore, you make the argument that, yes, of course, someone knowledgeable in that craft can come in and check your work. Or is it more similar to a work of art, and interpretation of the work of art is totally subjective? And so what you're getting is someone's interpretation of a work of art. At Omega, another one of the keynote speakers, Dr. Siddharth Ramakrishnan, a neuroscience professor, also presented us with difficult questions. And it's relevant in the context of these particular philosophical ponderings. Here's the question. Is your intuition always right? Is psychic knowledge always accurate and therefore reliable? You often hear psychics and intuitives talk about how your intuition is always right and trust your intuition. If it's wrong, then, well, easy. It was not true psychic knowledge. That wasn't your intuition talking to you. That was your ego. You hear that all the time. The argument that the very nature of psychically accessed knowledge is always right. An interesting point raised during Siddharth's master class was, do you tell yourself to always trust your intuition when in dangerous situations? Perhaps you are inclined to answer yes. Yes, of course. But then what about bias? What if our intuition of danger is driven by bias? What is the connection or correlation between intuitive knowledge of danger and our fun pop culture references to Karens? Okay, I'm just going to leave that there and continue on. Maybe I'm just going to cut and edit that out. I don't know. I think we convince ourselves that we can separate intuition over here, which is pure and perfect and never wrong, and then bias over here. So because we're putting intuition over here and bias over here, separating them out into separate corners, we are saying that if there is bias, then it's not intuition. If it's pure intuitive or even psychic knowledge, then it is untarnished by bias. I'm not sure I believe that. Do you? Back to the question, how do you reconcile multiple different divinatory answers to the same question you've presented repeatedly? Typically, fortune tellers and diviners will say something to the effect of, you cannot ask the same question repeatedly because it shows insincerity, and now the divine won't answer your question sincerely because you are not sincere. Is that really a sincere response though, or is that just us bullshitting people? Then there's also the rationale that's often spit out that, by repeatedly asking the same question over and over again, you are demonstrating your lack of faith in the divine. And since you lack faith, you won't be rewarded. I don't know how I feel about that rationale. I don't believe and I don't accept that a divine sentience in all their wisdom would be offended by sincere good faith interrogation. None of this is to say that divination is BS. I think the type of people watching a video like this one will have had really powerful, unexplainable, mysterious experiences with divination that go well beyond coincidence. And to dismiss that would be equally ignorant, equally irrational. Divination is a deeply enriching, profound, valuable practice that provides a depth of insight like no other. But that does not mean that we slink away and avoid the difficult questions. I did used to be the type to say that the cards or the divinatory tool is always right. And so when a divinatory reading is perceived as inaccurate or turns out to be inaccurate, wrong, it's the reason for that is human error, not the divination tool. So I used to keep the divination tool faultless and perfected, and it is me, the human, that made a judgment call that was wrong. But now I'm wondering if I need to backpedal on that belief system and come up with a different perspective. I think that accuracy and reliability rests 100% entirely on the reader, the diviner, and that in some way there's no such thing, like there's no repeatable objective interpretation of a divinatory reading by a third party coming in to clinically assess and give a second opinion of that reading result. It's maybe some version of the observer effect per quantum mechanics at play, in addition to relevancy of the uncertainty principle, Heisenberg's uncertainty principle. I'm guessing. So a divinatory reading result per the tool is, in my new revised perspective, inextricable and cannot be separately evaluated from the diviner or interpreter themselves in the moment of that divination ritual. It's the unique, cannot be repeated magic of the moment. Either magic has happened and a reader gives you a reliable reading in the moment of divinatory ritual, or the magic did not happen and a reader does not give you a reliable reading. You cannot take the two-dimensional divinatory reading and remove it from the person who cast the reading, from the hand that dealt the cards. So in a way, in that sense, you can't get a second opinion by that approach. The second opinion you would get would be to get a new diviner, new divinatory reading as cast by a new individual diviner in a totally separate, independent, new divinatory ritual. And then which one is accurate would be dependent on whether or not so-called magic happens in the moment of that divinatory ritual with this diviner and this diviner or that diviner. So then it's not like getting 2 or 3 different doctors to look at the same mole. No, I think it's probably more like getting a couple of different artists to paint separate and different paintings per their interpretation with the same set of instructions. And the instructions are, paint me a vision of the future. Returning to the question presented, is divinatory readings always reliable? Well, my new theory, revised, is it depends on the power of the diviner and the efficacy of that specific divinatory ritual cast in that moment. Can you always trust your intuition? Sorry for the cliche buzzwords, but it depends on if you've done the shadow work. But I didn't come on here to tell you what to think. In fact, I came on here to ask you what you think. So what do you think? Poll number 1, is a divinatory reading always reliable? Poll number 2, if a querent presents the same question to 5 different readers and gets 5 very different answers, what is your theory of reconciliation? How do you reconcile that? Poll number 3, if we see a set spread of cards that hypothetically answers some divinatory question and 5 different readers interpret that same spread of cards 5 different ways, what is your metric for determining who is right and who is wrong? Returning to that small group exercise that Mary had led, what do you, a divinatory reader, do when your objective, impartial, and unbiased reading of the divinatory result tells you one answer, but your real-life experiences, your biases, be that beneficial or harmful in this instance, your common sense, even your intuition or psychic download, is giving you the opposite answer? My approach as a reader would be to give both answers. I would say, this is what the cards are telling me, this is why, so just show my work to give the rational basis for why I came to that conclusion, or the Book of Changes, the I Ching is saying this, And then I'd make a dramatic show of setting it aside and say, but me, as someone who has lived some years on this planet, this is what I'm telling you. And I'm not even telling that to you as advice at all. I think every tarot reader needs to figure out what they are comfortable with and make their own judgment calls on how they would deal with situations like that. And I don't think every single tarot reader will necessarily arrive at the same answer. We all have very different comfort levels and our boundaries are drawn in different places. By the way, I did want to preemptively apologize that I don't always, or I'm not always able to come up with something responsive to reply back to your comments, but I definitely read every single one, and I really take to heart everything you say.